Hey there. Tonight, we'll walk into the heart of the medieval forge. We'll stand beside an armorer as he works the bellows, strikes the iron, and turns raw metal into the armor that once covered kings and common soldiers alike. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights, light a candle if you have one, or just let your screen flicker like the coals of a forge. Maybe let a soft hum play in the background. Close your eyes and let's ease into this journey together. The day begins not with songbirds or the toll of church bells, but with silence, thick, still, and cold. In the low-light hush of a foggy morning in a small English town in the year 1372, a man named Oswin opens his eyes. He lies beneath a coarse wool blanket in a narrow cot stuffed with straw, the edges of the room etched in faint shadow. His bones ache faintly, though he's only 40. Old for some, young for an armorer whose muscles have been worked like iron. He hears no one yet. Not his apprentice, not his wife, not even the chickens outside. But he knows the forge must be lit before sunrise. Oswin swings his legs off the cot, feet meeting the cold stone floor. He moves with the economy of someone who has done this countless times. The room is small, half living quarters, half workspace. A curtain hangs to separate the sleeping space from the hearth, which is long cold. He pulls on a coarse linen shirt, then leather breeches stiff with soot and wear. He adds a thick wool tunic over top. His boots, heavy and cracked with age, go on last. From a wooden bowl beside the hearth, he splashes well water on his face. It's cold, sharp, and biting. His eyes fully open now, he crosses the room and opens a small shutter, letting in the gray pre-dawn light. Outside, the town is still sleeping. The baker hasn't lit his ovens. The tanners haven't begun their stink. But soon the town will stir, and with it, the needs of war and worry. Breakfast is a simple affair. A leftover oat cake, hardened from the previous day, softened in watered-down ale. Oswin eats standing up, watching as smoke begins to rise from a neighboring chimney. He doesn't smile, but he does feel something like satisfaction. His body remembers the routine. He moves into the workshop portion of his home. Here, the air smells different, of oil, iron, coal, and fire. Tools line the walls, hammers, tongs, swages, fullers, punches. The forge stands at the far end, empty and dark. He crosses to it, kneeling to inspect the coals from yesterday. Mostly ash now. Still, a few embers glow faintly. He fans them gently, nursing them with dry straw and thin splinters of oak. The fire begins to take, and he feeds it with patience. Layer by layer, he adds larger chunks of charcoal, bellows hung beside him working steadily. A rhythm starts. Puff, crackle, puff, crackle. The red deepens. The forge awakens. Oswin listens carefully. A good fire tells you what it needs. Too fast and it'll choke itself. Too slow and it won't hold heat. He's learned these lessons not from books. He cannot read, but from time, from burns, from failed blades and brittle joints. The forge alive, he turns his attention to the anvil. It stands like a king in the center of the room, blackened and nicked with age. Each mark is a memory. That one, when he misjudged the edge of a cuirass and sent sparks into his eye. That one, when his apprentice dropped a half-finished helm. That dent, when a visiting knight demanded his breastplate more fashionable, and Oswin had to start over. He begins preparing his workspace. Leather apron donned, tools arranged, scraps of parchment, each bearing a rough sketch or measurement laid out. Some orders are repairs, others are commissions. One is from a minor noble seeking a new bassinet for his nephew's first campaign. Oswin rubs his jaw. The boy won't last a week, he thinks, but the coin is good. Outside, footsteps approach, a creak of the door. It's Wymond, his apprentice, 14, freckled, eager, and always late. He stammers an apology as he steps inside, wiping sleep from his eyes. "You're late, boy," Oswin says, not unkindly. "Fetch water, then coal. We've work." The boy nods, rushing to his tasks. Oswin watches him go, remembering his own apprenticeship, nearly 30 years ago, under Master Edric. Edric, who once threw a heated horseshoe at him for ruining a buckle. Oswin chuckles to himself. He's kinder than Edric ever was. The forge now fully lit, he places the first piece of steel into the fire. It's a dull thing now, flat, roughly cut, lifeless. But in it, Oswin sees potential, not just for protection, but for identity. A man in armor walks taller. Even if he's afraid, he looks brave. Even if he's weak, he looks strong. Armor, like a mask, changes how the world sees you. Oswin lifts the glowing metal with his tongs and lays it on the anvil. The first strike lands, clean, firm, and sure. Sparks fly, dancing like tiny stars. Another strike, another. The sound is both deafening and comforting. It echoes in the bones. From outside, the town begins to wake. A cock crows. A church bell tolls the hour. Children's voices rise. But within these walls, all sound bends to the hammer. The day has begun, and so has the shaping, not just of metal, but of purpose. Oswin the armorer does not ride into battle. He does not hold the sword, but his work becomes the skin of warriors. And in the quiet clang of morning, he knows that is enough. Tomorrow may bring lords or knights, coin or complaint, failure or fire. But for now, he lifts the hammer again. The anvil awakens, and with it, so does history. But before there is armor, there must be fire. Oswin stands at the edge of the forge once again, now fully awake and aware of the task that lies ahead. The air outside still carries a chill, but in here, inside the thick timber walls of his smithy, the anticipation of heat is already beginning to bloom. Lighting the forge is not a mere step in the process. It is the heartbeat. Without it, there is no shaping, no hardening, no tempering. Without it, steel remains stubborn, lifeless. He reaches for the charcoal, stored in a wooden bin lined with old canvas to keep the dust from escaping. This charcoal has been carefully prepared from oak, burned slowly over days in a covered pit to produce the dense, light fuel that burns long and hot. Oswin knows the smell of good charcoal instantly. Dry and earthy, almost sweet, with no trace of rot or moisture. Bad charcoal chokes the fire, and worse, makes the metal impure. Beside the forge, Wymond returns with a pail of water in one hand and an armful of split kindling in the other. Oswin nods silently and begins to lay the foundation. Thin twigs at the base, arranged like the ribs of a small, beast. On top of that, he layers dry bark and shavings. Then he places the charcoal, one chunk at a time, careful not to crush the air pockets needed for ignition. At his feet lies the bellows, a heavy leather bladder set between two wooden boards, connected to the forge by a narrow iron pipe. It will feed the fire its breath. Without it, the flame gasps and flickers. With it, it roars. He strikes a flint against steel, once, twice, and then a spark lands where it needs to. Smoke curls upward. Wymond kneels to blow gently, his cheeks puffing with nervous pride. The kindling catches. Orange blossoms flicker in the shadows. "Keep it slow," Oswin mutters. "Let it settle. Then we feed it." Together, they work in rhythm. Oswin manages the fire's architecture. Wymond pumps the bellows with one foot, slow and steady. As the flame rises, so does the temperature. The charcoal begins to glow red, then white at the center. The room begins to change. Heat creeps along the walls. Shadows dance wildly on the stone and wood. A bead of sweat forms at Oswin's brow. The forge is waking up. There is something primal in the moment. No matter how many years he has done this, Oswin always feels it. A kind of reverence. To light the forge is to summon controlled chaos. Within these flames, steel will be reborn. Pieces of earth, extracted and refined, will bend to the will of man. He lays a small iron rod into the heart of the flame. They wait. When he pulls it out again, it glows a deep orange. "Too cool," Oswin says. "More air." Wymond nods and quickens the bellows. The fire responds with a whoosh, and now the iron flares bright yellow. Better. Oswin knows this is only the beginning. Every kind of metal needs a different touch. Too hot, and it will spark and crack. Too cold, and it will resist the hammer. The forge's mood changes with the weather, the wood, the wind. No 2 days are alike. The forge begins to hum, soft at first, then louder, like a beast breathing. It's an old forge, inherited from his master. The stone hearth is cracked in places, patched with clay and iron staples, but it still works. Like Oswin himself, it bears its years with dignity. By the time the sun crests the horizon, the forge is alive. The air shimmers with heat. Tools have warmed in their racks. Steel bars lie ready for shaping. Oswin wipes his brow and steps back, satisfied. Lighting the forge is not a chore. It is a rite, a rebirth of fire, steel, and labor. In this glowing heart, everything begins. Tomorrow, he will light it again. But today, the fire is ready. And so is he. The forge roars like a beast behind him, heat licking at Oswin's back as he moves across the cramped smithy. The day is properly begun now. The sky outside is a brightening gray, and the town is stirring with the sounds of waking. The clang of another smith's hammer rings faintly from across the lane, shoeing horses, no doubt. But Oswin's trade is finer, sharper, and far more deadly. Before he shapes even a single piece of steel, before hammer meets iron, Oswin must prepare the silent chorus of his craft, his tools. He pauses at the long oak bench, stained dark with years of sweat and soot. Above it, tools hang in neat rows along iron nails and hooks, each exactly where it should be. There's a quiet reverence to this wall, a shrine of labor. He reaches first for his favorite hammer, the one with the worn ashwood haft and the slightly uneven head. The handle bears the faint imprint of his grip. years of calloused palms pressing into it, smoothing it like river stone. There are other hammers, of course, dozens, ball peens and cross peens, straight peens, and flatter hammers, some with square heads for clean edges, others rounded for gentle shaping. Each has its voice. The wrong hammer speaks too loudly or not at all. Oswin listens carefully when he strikes. He selects a fuller next, used to draw out metal, to stretch it like dough before the shaping begins. Its face is curved, allowing him to crease the steel with precision. This tool, like many in his shop, was handed down by his master, and likely by his master before him. The haft is wrapped in thin leather to ease the shock of impact. Wymond enters with the coal bucket, placing it near the forge, and stops to watch his master work. "You remember their names yet?" Oswin asks without turning. "I know the flatter, the fuller, the drift pin." The boy trails off, sheepish. Oswin grunts. "And the swage?" Wymond nods, used to shape curves, for rounding the edges of the breastplate. "Good?" Oswin doesn't smile, but there is a trace of approval in his voice. From a small chest beneath the bench, Oswin retrieves punches and chisels, each wrapped in rough linen. They are sharp, angular, unforgiving. These are not the glamorous tools knights talk about, not swords or lances, but they're the true weapons of the armorer. They carve vent holes into helms, pierce rivet holes into gauntlets, and score lines where steel must bend. He sets them down gently, like instruments before a symphony. On a low shelf beside the forge lies a row of tongs, long iron arms of various shapes and lengths. Some curve inward to grip narrow billets of steel. Others have flat, padded jaws for holding larger plates. These are extensions of his hands. Without them, he'd be burned 100 times before noon. They are marked with scratches and soot, but Oswin oils them weekly, careful not to let rust find a home. The anvil, of course, is already awake. Oswin runs his hand along its surface, feeling the cool steel beneath the rising warmth of the forge. Its face is slightly concave from years of hammering, normal wear. The horn is sharp and smooth, used for curves and arches. Along one edge, a hardy hole allows him to insert specialty tools, like the cut-off hardy he uses to slice through hot metal. The anvil is heavy, near 200 pounds, and unmoving, the anchor of the entire shop. "Why do we polish the tools, master?" Wymond asks suddenly. Oswin straightens and gestures to the walls. "Because a dirty tool makes dirty armor. Rust in the fuller leaves scars. Dust on the flatter causes pits. And pits kill men." The boy blinks, taking in the weight of that. Oswin doesn't dramatize his work. There's no need. His customers are knights, soldiers, men-at-arms. They stake their lives on his craftsmanship. If a rivet fails, if a helm cracks under a mace, someone dies. 100 battles are won or lost long before the field. Sometimes they are lost on this very bench. He picks up a file used for smoothing edges and holds it up to the light. Even now, in the flicker of forge flame and morning sun, he can see fine flecks of steel clinging to the teeth. He brushes it clean, slowly, methodically. Not all tools are iron. Nearby, stretched across a frame, is a large slab of waxed leather, used as a backing when hammering smaller fittings. It's soft enough to protect, but firm enough to resist. Beside it lies a whetstone, soaked in oil. used to keep chisels razor sharp. Next to that, a crude wooden model of a human torso, carved and padded, where Oswin checks armor fits before customers arrive. He's even made his own templates, patterns cut from thick parchment, representing standard sizes of pauldron, greave, and gorget. They hang like laundry along a line near the rafters, fluttering when the forge breathes hard. By the time Oswin is done checking and arranging his tools, the smithy has taken on its full shape. It is no longer just a room. It is a crucible, a place of transformation. Ore becomes armor. Heat becomes hope. Outside, the first of today's customers is arriving. Through the open door, Oswin can hear the creak of saddles and the clank of loose mail. A squire appears first, barely more than a child, leading a nervous destrier with a dented helmet dangling from the saddle. "Wait with him," Oswin tells Wymond. "Tell him I'll be out shortly." The apprentice nods and scurries away. Oswin takes a final moment to survey his kingdom of iron and ash. Every tool has a place. Every dent has a history. There is no ceremony, no prayer, but this order, is sacred. He picks up his hammer and walks toward the anvil. Now, the real work begins. The wind outside carried with it the scent of churned mud and horse sweat, riding weather, the kind that made men seek shelter, or, if noble enough, demand the finest steel to brace them against their enemies. As Oswin wiped soot from his brow, a shadow passed the threshold of his smithy, long and deliberate. It was not the skittish step of a squire, nor the hurried trot of a courier. This, Oswin knew instantly, was someone with money in his purse and pride in his spine. "Master Oswin," came the voice, smooth, clipped, and slightly bored. A knight's voice. Oswin turned, hands still gloved in blackened leather. Standing in the doorway was a man clad in rich but travel-worn clothing, burgundy surcoat, belt of polished brass, boots spattered with road grime but made of good leather. His gloves were finely stitched, his beard short and waxed. Behind him stood a thinner lad, barely 16, holding the reins of a sleek palfrey and clutching a bundled parcel wrapped in linen. "My lord," Oswin greeted him, inclining his head just slightly, not deep enough to be servile, but enough to respect the chain of command that ruled this land as surely as any sword. The man stepped inside, nostrils flaring slightly at the smell of forge and oil. "I am Sir Aldred of Cheswick," he said, as though the name should carry its own gravity. "You were recommended to me by Sir Ranulph of Derby. You fitted his greaves last winter, did you not?" "I did." "He cracked them before Lent," Oswin replied, suppressing a smile. "He was pleased?" Sir Aldred gave a dismissive sniff. He survived. Oswin took that as high praise from a man who likely measured quality in blood, spared rather than elegance. The parcel was unwrapped and laid on the bench. Inside was a dented breastplate, gleaming in places, scraped in others. One of the shoulder pieces had cracked at the rivet, and the left flank showed a deep gouge that Oswin knew came not from battle, but likely a careless drop in transport. He didn't say so aloud. Nobles did not like being reminded of their clumsiness. "Refit," Aldred said simply. "My nephew will wear it now. Needs adjusting. He's thinner and taller, but not much. The helmet needs reshaping too. He says it pinches." Oswin nodded, already measuring with his eyes. "Will the boy fight?" "In training. Under Lord Edric at Stowe, They're drilling for the campaign season. Another boy to march for another cause, Oswin thought. Another noble's heir shoved into war before his chin had filled in. Still, a paying client was a paying client. He called for Wymond, who emerged from the back, a smudge across his cheek. Fetch the measuring rod and the fitting doublet. Sir Aldred stepped aside to let his nephew enter. The lad was gangly, shoulders too narrow for the armor as it stood. His fingers twitched nervously at his sides. "Name?" Oswin asked. "William," the boy replied, his voice a crackling whisper. Oswin grunted. "Stand tall, William. I need to see the frame, not the fear." The measurements were quick, but precise. Oswin moved like a tailor with steel, marking the spots where adjustments were needed, checking for articulation at the elbows and hips, noting how the lad flinched when the helm pressed too tightly at the temples. As he worked, Sir Aldred wandered the shop, examining weapons and half-finished pieces. He stopped at a half-formed gauntlet on the bench and tapped it thoughtfully. "You do fine work, Oswin. Not like that smith in Harrogate. He sent me a helm so thin I could have bent it with my teeth." Oswin didn't respond, but inwardly winced. Some smiths were desperate enough for noble coin that they cut corners. He never did. His name was stamped on the inside of every plate beneath the padding, unseen, but not unimportant. Reputation, like steel, must be forged and tempered. Too brittle, and it would shatter under pressure. "The fitting will take 3 days," Oswin said finally. 4 if I must replace the side plates entirely. The helm I can reshape. Give him some breath room and reduce the pressure along the brow. But if he's to grow, you'll need a new set. In a year. "God willing," Aldred muttered. "If he lives that long." It wasn't said cruelly, just plainly, like noting rain was likely in autumn. The knight tossed a small pouch onto the bench. Oswin caught it by the weight alone. Coin. Not much, but enough to begin. He'd ask for the rest on delivery. When the nobles left, the smithy felt oddly still. Wymond stood silently, staring at the armor. "Will he fight?" the boy asked. Oswin didn't answer right away. He turned the breastplate over in his hands, tracing the gouge with his thumb. The scratch was deep, but the steel had held. Good work, even if it was a few years old. He remembered shaping it. He remembered the metal, how it sang when struck. "Maybe," he said at last. "Maybe he'll fight. Maybe he'll die before he does. Either way, we do our part." Wymond frowned. "But if the armor fails—" "It won't," Oswin interrupted. "Because we don't fail." He began cleaning the breastplate, setting it beside the cracked shoulder plate. In the coming days, he would recut it, anneal it, redrill the rivet holes, and reharden the steel. The helm would be placed in the coals, reshaped with care. The liner replaced with padded cloth from the seamstress down the street. All this for a boy who might never draw a sword. But it didn't matter. The nobility came with their pride and their coin, their squires and nephews, and endless wars. Oswin dealt with them all. He didn't need to like them. He just needed them to come back, and alive, if possible. Because while they gambled with lives, Oswin dealt only in iron. And iron, he knew, could be trusted. The forge was alive again, its heart glowing orange and white, the heat licking up in waves that shimmered against the walls. Oswin stood before it, hammer in hand, as though standing before a sacred altar. And in many ways, he was. Here, in this infernal heat, he would shape more than just metal. He would shape safety, pride, and survival. The steel lay on the anvil like a sleeping beast. It was a raw plate, dull and unformed, quarried from the bowels of the earth, refined in smelting fires, then cut into manageable sheets by men who did not know its final purpose. Now it had come to Oswin, and he would give it its name. This piece was for a breastplate, a reworking of Sir Aldred's old harness for the lad William. Oswin had already done the measurements, sketched rough outlines with chalk, and scored faint guides on the plate itself. But shaping the steel, that was a task that required both patience and precision. You didn't just hammer it into form. You persuaded it. He reached for the tongs, gripping the plate at the edge and easing it into the forge. The fire swallowed it greedily, coiling around the metal with a low hiss. Wymond pumped the bellows in slow rhythm, his face pink from the heat, eyes gleaming with the reflection of flame. Oswin let the steel soak in the fire until it blushed red, then orange, then just barely yellow. That was the moment. Not too soon, not too late. He pulled it out, laid it on the anvil, and struck. The first blow was always the loudest. It rang through the smithy like a bell, vibrating through Oswin's shoulders into his spine. Sparks exploded outward, brilliant and brief like the flash of a battlefield unseen. The second blow followed, angled slightly, the hammer glancing off the edge to begin curving the form. Each strike had a purpose. Flatten here, bend there, stretch this edge, compress that one. Oswin's movements were not wild or brutish. They were measured, calculated, like a sculptor carving form from marble. Only his material resisted far more. He rotated the plate, struck again, and the rhythm began to settle. The ringing of the hammer became its own kind of music, sharp, echoing, hypnotic. Wymond watched silently, knowing better than to speak during shaping. This was not a moment for distraction. It was communion. The curve of a breastplate must follow the body, not the soft lines of flesh, but the angles of bone beneath. Oswin knew the geometry by heart. He had shaped plates for burly knights, wiry men-at-arms, and once, even a woman who disguised herself to fight alongside her brother. Each body was different, but the rules of protection were the same. Deflect the blow, absorb the strike, preserve the breath. He reheated the steel and moved to a dishing stump, a thick oak block with a hollow carved into the top. This is where the shaping became more complex. He placed the plate into the hollow and began hammering with a rounded mallet, coaxing the steel into a dome-like shape. Each impact deepened the curve. Sweat dripped from his chin. His arms burned with effort. "You don't beat steel into shape," he'd once told Wymond. "You learn its mood. You guide it." He could feel the steel yielding, just enough. Not too brittle, not too soft, a good batch, likely refined with manganese and carbon in balanced measure. He'd seen poor steel come from the Low Countries once, too grainy, prone to cracking at the edges. This, though, this was English, likely from Kent or Derby. Reliable, honest. Hours passed. Wymond fetched more water. The bellows hissed and groaned. Outside, townsfolk moved about their day, vendors calling out wares, children laughing in the alleys, hooves striking cobblestone. But inside the smithy, there was only the shaping. By midday, the basic form was complete. Oswin lifted it, checking the curvature against a wooden form modeled after a man's chest. Not perfect yet, but close. He would need to planish it next, fine-tuning the shape with hundreds of lighter hammer blows. It was slow, meticulous work, but vital. Planishing smoothed the surface, removed ripples, and hardened the exterior through repeated impact. He hung the plate from a wire hook overhead, letting it dangle freely. Then, with a smaller hammer and a rounded stake, he began tapping. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was lighter now, like rain on a roof. Each tap adjusted the metal by fractions. He moved in spirals from the center outward, correcting subtle imperfections. Wymond took over the bellows. He knew his master would be absorbed for the next hour at least. Planishing was the quiet part. The part where thought took over from muscle. The part where the armorer turned brute labor into craftsmanship. Oswin's mind drifted as he worked. He remembered the first time he'd shaped steel alone. His master had been away, visiting the castle smithy at the Baron's estate, and Oswin, barely 16, had attempted a vombrace on his own. It had turned out warped and useless, but he'd kept it. Still had it, somewhere in a chest under his cot, a reminder of humility. Back then, the steel had mocked him. Now, it answered to him. By late afternoon, the breastplate gleamed faintly under a light coat of linseed oil. The curve was even, the weight balanced, the edges trimmed and rounded. He would later punch holes for the leather straps and hinges. He would rivet the side flanges and prepare it for polishing. But the hard shaping was done. Oswin set the plate aside on a padded cloth and stretched his shoulders. His tunic clung to his back with sweat. His hands ached with satisfaction. Good steel, he muttered. It listened well. Wymond came to peer at the piece. Looks like a night already, he said. Oswin chuckled. Aye, now we just need the night to fill it. They would move on to the helmet tomorrow, and the pauldrons after that. Shaping steel was never truly finished. Every piece led to another. Every curve demanded its twin. The body was a puzzle of armor, and each day, Oswin fitted a piece into place. Outside, the sky turned amber with evening. The forge dimmed, embers glowing like the eyes of a tired beast. Oswin wiped his hands and sat for a moment on the edge of a bench, watching the breastplate cool. In a few weeks, it would ride into battle. It would face arrows and axes, and the fury of men who did not care how long it took to make. But it would hold, because it had been shaped not just with fire and hammer, but with care. And in that, Oswin took quiet pride. Meanwhile, Wymond's hands were raw again. Blisters, half-formed and angry, had bloomed across his palms where the hammer haft had rubbed skin to pulp. He didn't complain. Apprentices weren't supposed to. But the pain flared every time he gripped the tongs. It was only his second year in Oswin's smithy, and though he tried to walk tall, he still winced sometimes. Oswin noticed. Of course he did. He just didn't mention it. Instead, he passed the boy a strip of thin leather. "Wrap this round your grip," he said one morning, nodding at the hammer Wymond had just lifted. Won't heal it, but it'll keep you working. Thank you, Master, Wyman mumbled, adjusting the leather nervously. Oswin grunted, already turning back to the half-formed helm on the anvil. Outside, a soft mist clung to the cobbled lane. The town was stirring slowly, dogs barking, shutters opening, a church bell tolling prime. Inside the smithy, the world was smaller, quieter in its way, a place of heat and steel, rhythm and dust. Wyman had come to Oswin at the age of 13, sent by a father who couldn't feed all 6 mouths at home. He'd been skinny then, legs like willow branches and ears too large for his face. Oswin had taken him on reluctantly, not because the boy lacked potential, but because he'd sworn, after his last apprentice ran off to join a mercenary band, that he'd work alone from now on. But the boy had stood at the door with quiet eyes and calloused feet, and something in that silence reminded Oswin of himself. So, he'd relented. Apprenticeship was never gentle. Wyman's first weeks had been endless chains of chores, hauling water from the well, splitting logs for the forge, sweeping cinders, scrubbing soot from tools, and standing perfectly still while Oswin muttered over measurements. But he never shirked, never argued. His silence, Oswin discovered, wasn't fear. It was observation. "You're always watchin'," Oswin said once, glancing up from a breastplate. "Why?" "To remember how you do it, Master," Wyman answered simply. And he did. By the end of his first year, Wyman could recite the order of tools on the rack, knew the proper shape and scent of good charcoal, could distinguish wrought iron from mild steel by the sound it made when struck. He learned that iron hissed differently depending on its temperature. That leather boiled. In wax shrank tight around armor joints. That chain links must be peened and riveted, never welded. But there was more to learn than hammering and fire. "You know why we dome the top of a helmet?" Oswin asked him one afternoon, pointing to a newly dished bassinet. "So it glances blows away?" "Aye. But there's more. Makes the helm stronger too. Geometry, lad. Curves carry weight better than flats. A flat plate will dent easier. A dome spreads the force." Wyman blinked. "Like a church roof." Oswin raised an eyebrow. "Well, look at that. Thought you weren't listening to the priest." "I wasn't. I was looking at the ceiling." Oswin smirked. Maybe the boy would do just fine. Later, Wyman learned how to make rivets, heating narrow rods of iron, hammering one end flat, snipping them to length, and sliding them through the armor's holes before peening the other side down. It was delicate work. Too much force, and you'd crack the plate. Too little, and it would rattle. He practiced on scraps, burning his fingers more than once, grimacing when the rivet bent sideways. Oswin offered no comfort, only repetition. "Do it again," he said, every time. And Wyman did. One day, Oswin finally handed him a real piece, a gorget, the neck guard for a suit of armor. Simple curve, 3 straps, measure twice. You mess it up, I'll have you scrub the latrine buckets at the priory till Michaelmas. Wyman nodded solemnly, though inside he buzzed with pride. He worked late into the night, shaping the metal on a domed stake, planishing the surface, testing the fit with a wooden dummy Oswin had built years ago. When it was done, he laid it on the cloth-covered bench, like a relic, and waited for morning. Oswin inspected it in silence. His fingers traced the lines, pressed the curves, tugged the rivets. "Hinge is crooked," he said finally, "but the curve's good. Strong edge. It'll hold." That was the highest praise Wymond had ever heard. That same day, they received a visit from a squire in Lord Dunmere's livery, asking for a rush order of mail chausses, leg armor, for a knight riding to Wales within a fortnight. Oswin agreed reluctantly. "Mail takes time," he muttered after the boy left. "Fool thinks I'm a weaver." But he set Wymond to it immediately, cutting the drawn wire into links, coiling them around a rod, clipping them by hand, and then flattening and piercing each one with a tiny punch. Thousands of links, each one forged, shaped, and joined. Wymond's fingers cramped, his eyes blurred, but link by link the chausses grew. By the end of the week, his hands were bleeding again, but he didn't stop. And Oswin said nothing, just slid him a salve of goose fat and nettles. Sometimes, late at night, Wymond would lie in his cot in the corner of the smithy, listening to the cooling pop of the forge stones and the faint whistle of wind outside. He'd stare at the beams above him and wonder if he'd ever be good enough to make an entire suit on his own. One night, he finally asked, "Master?" he whispered into the dark. When did you know you were ready?" Oswin didn't answer for a long time. Then quietly, "When I stopped worrying if I was." Wymond didn't reply, but he remembered. By spring, Oswin let Wymond polish finished pieces, then drill, then temper. Bit by bit, the trust grew. He was still an apprentice. He still fetched coal and swept the floor and burned his knuckles on stubborn hinges. But now, when Oswin looked at him, it wasn't with doubt, it was with expectation. And that, Wymond knew, was the beginning of becoming a master. There was a certain look the customers all had when they stepped through the smithy door. Some came with coin in hand, others with swagger in their boots. A few arrived bruised and red-faced, having taken a beating in gear not made by Oswin's hand. And then there were those who came with lists, long ones, written by scribes in tight, perfumed letters that had never known a day's labor. No matter their background, they all bore the same assumption, that their needs were immediate, their coin the most golden, and their armor of utmost importance. Oswin was used to it. It was mid-morning, the forge glowing and the air in the smithy hot as a summer kiln. Wymond was at the side bench, polishing a rear brace with ground pumice and cloth. Oswin stood over a pair of greaves, hammering rivets home with the steady rhythm of a man who let the metal speak first. The door creaked. "Smith, a word." Oswin didn't look up. He knew that tone. Entitled, nasal, and sharpened by a thin coat of arrogance. Noble-born, perhaps, or worse, newly knighted. The man who entered wore a blue surcoat emblazoned with a lion rampant. His cloak, fine wool dyed with expensive woad, swept behind him like a challenge. He wasn't old, perhaps 30, but he already wore a sword, like it was part of him. His boots were too clean. "I require a full harness," the knight declared. "Fitted, light, for a campaign in Brittany. Must be ready within the fortnight." Oswin slowly set down his hammer, then turned. "You're asking for a miracle, sir." "I'm offering payment." "So do they all," Oswin muttered. The knight raised a brow. "Are you Oswin? The one who made Sir Piers's half-plate at Poitiers?" "Aye." then you can manage it." Oswin gave a long, slow nod and motioned to the stool near the bench. "Sit, then. We measure." The process was slow. Oswin didn't rush it. He never did. He pulled out a cord marked with soot lines, measuring arm length, chest width, inseam, collar to hip. He noted where the knight had bulk, where he'd need room to twist or ride. Wymond scribbled down notes with charcoal on scrap parchment. "I fight fast," the knight said as Oswin measured his shoulder. "I want the harness to move with me." "You're not dancing," Oswin said flatly. The knight scowled. "I don't want to be weighed like a mule." "You want it strong or fast? You can't have both." "I want both." Oswin grunted. There was always one. After the man left, leaving behind a deposit and a vague insult about the soot in the air, Wymond leaned in and whispered, "Do they always think they're the first one to want magic armor?" Oswin just chuckled. Not all customers were as bold. Some came with genuine need and little coin. Men-at-arms with battered hauberks, farmers seeking to mend a rusted helm handed down from a dead uncle, merchants hoping for a brigandine to wear on the road to York. Oswin never turned away honest men. Once, an aging guard from the city watch had limped in holding a dented kettle hat under one arm and his pride under the other. "Still got 2 sons to raise," he said. "Don't need new. Just enough to stop a brick." Oswin charged him only for the iron rivets and sent him off with a repaired strap and a nod. But then there were the complaints. They arrived in person or by courier, sometimes even by priest. Once, a fuming page arrived on a lathered pony, holding a vambrace like it was a rotten turnip. "Sir Theobald says it pinches his elbow." Oswin looked at the arm guard, then at the page. "Tell him not to bend it backward, then." Still, some complaints were fair. Sometimes straps wore too thin. Sometimes a rivet slipped loose. Once, Oswin had misjudged the shape of a salet's visor, and a young knight nearly broke his nose before a duel. Oswin repaired the mistake, free of charge. He cursed himself for days. Mistakes happened, but rarely twice. Then came the clerics. Their complaints weren't about metal. They disapproved of armor itself, of war, of the hammer's violence. One gray-robed friar had wandered in during Lent, glancing nervously at the forge. "Brother," he said, "does your work not weigh upon your soul?" Oswin had paused mid-strike, the tongs still clamped on red-hot steel. "I make protection," he replied, "not swords. But protection for killing." Oswin looked the friar in the eye. "Better that a man comes home in armor than not at all." The friar left without another word. Most of Oswin's customers weren't lords or warriors. They were ordinary men caught in the tides of bigger forces, levied to fight in a campaign they didn't understand, outfitted poorly by quartermasters, relying on craftsmen like Oswin to make sure they saw the next sunrise. That knowledge weighed more than complaints or pride. Late one evening, a boy no older than 16 arrived. He wore a patched tunic and boots held together with string. He said nothing at first, just held out a small pouch with a few coins and a dented bassinet. "My brother," the boy finally said. He didn't come back, but the helmet did. Oswin took it gently, The visor was split. A clean blow. He cleaned it, riveted the crack shut, and handed it back 2 days later. "For your next fight," he said. The boy looked down. "I'm not a soldier." "You will be," Oswin replied quietly. There were no complaints then, just silence. Back in the workshop, Wyman asked, "Why didn't you keep it?" "Because it still has a job to do," Oswin said. Customers came and went. Some were grateful. Some were impossible. But each one left a piece of their story in the soot. And in every clang of hammer on steel, Oswin built more than armor. He built remembrance. He built survival. He built the truth of the times, one rivet at a time. The anvil stood at the heart of Oswin's world. It wasn't just a block of iron. It was his altar, blackened with soot, pitted from decades of strikes. Its face gleamed in the firelight with the dull luster of a thing that had survived centuries of labor. Each dent told a story, a misblow, a hammer slip, a moment of triumph when metal bent just so. Before the sun crested the horizon, before even the first coal hissed in the forge, Oswin would stand before it in silence, as if seeking permission. This morning was no different. Wyman was still asleep, likely dreaming of warm bread and easy work, but Oswin was already lacing his leather apron. He approached the rack on the far wall where the tools of his trade rested like sleeping soldiers. They had names, not names. He spoke aloud, but ones he remembered like old friends. First, the hammers. There were over a dozen, and each had a purpose. The crosspeen, with its offset wedge-shaped head, was for drawing out metal, making it longer and thinner. The ball peen, its rounded end like an iron tear, shaped curves and knocked down burrs. His favorite was a simple, flat-faced forging hammer, heavy and honest, worn smooth by years of use. He picked it up now, testing its weight. Familiar, solid. The handle bore grooves from his grip, darkened with sweat and charcoal dust. It had never failed him. Next came the tongs. To an outsider, they all looked the same, rusted iron pincers of varying lengths and bends. But Oswin knew their differences intimately. Some were narrow-jawed for gripping sword tangs. Others had deep scoops for cradling hot rivets. One pair, notched on one side, had been forged by Oswin himself in his first year as a journeyman. Crude, but loyal. Each set was hung precisely where it belonged on a timber beam by the forge. If Wyman ever misplaced one, Oswin didn't scold him. He simply waited. Let the apprentice suffer the confusion of hunting for a tool mid-heat. That was how you learned. Then there were the fullers. These were not cutting tools, but shapers, used to create grooves, channels, and contours. A matched top and bottom set, they worked together like jaws, pressing lines into steel, like a sculptor with clay. Oswin had several, some narrow for fluting a vambrace, others broader for the shallow ridges and breastplates. Their use was delicate, almost tender. Strike too hard, and the line became a scar. And of course, the stakes. Mounted in heavy wooden blocks, these rounded forms acted as anvils of a different sort. They came in all shapes, domes, ridges, cones, each offering a surface to shape a different part of armor. A helmet might begin life on a flat stake, but end up on a hemispherical one to round the crown. A curved spalder needed a saddle stake to give it the right flow. Stakes shape shoulders as much as muscle, Oswin often said, half to himself, half to Wymond. At the far end of the shop sat a small chest. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were the delicate tools, punches for making holes, chisels for cutting leather or brass edging, tiny files for smoothing the inside of a gorget. Some had been gifts. Others were bartered from traveling smiths. A few he had made from broken nails, reshaped by fire and need. He laid them out like relics on a cloth, honoring them, preparing them. The forge was roaring now, bellows breathing life into flame. The orange glow reflected off the edges of the tools, turning them into embers themselves. From outside came the sound of clumsy footsteps, Wymond finally stirring. The boy stumbled in, hair tousled and eyes bleary. He stopped at the door, eyes scanning the tools already in place. "You laid them out already," he said, half apology, half awe. "Of course," Oswin replied, not looking up. Wymond approached the bench and touched one of the punches, flinching at its residual warmth from the forge. "How do you know which to use?" he asked. "So many look the same." "They are never the same," Oswin said. "Each one speaks. You just haven't learned their voices." The boy tilted his head. "They don't speak to me." "They will. Eventually." Oswin had learned that truth the hard way. In his early years, he'd struck blindly with the wrong hammer, scorched leather straps by resting them too close to the coals, twisted rivets into useless spirals. His master, Edric, had once flung a half-finished gauntlet at his head, shouting that tools are not extensions of your hands. They are your hands. It hadn't made sense then, but it did now. Each time Oswin picked up a fuller or punch or chisel, he could feel its history, the wrist ache from long hours, the time a chisel slipped and split his thumb, the quiet pride when a knight rode off with armor, shaped just right, not because of brute force, but because the tools had been used properly. Tools made the armorer, not the other way around. Even now, Oswin was inventing new ones, a strange, wedge-ended fuller he'd made to help crease the curved edge of a gorget, a flattened stake welded to a horse's shoe to round knuckles more evenly. When a tool didn't exist, he forged one. That was the armorer's creed: adapt or fail. He watched Wymond now as the boy awkwardly chose a pair of tongs and fumbled them into place. "Too wide," Oswin said without turning. Wymond switched them. "Too narrow." Another swap. "Better." Oswin nodded. "Will I ever remember them all?" the apprentice asked sheepishly. "No," Oswin said, "but your hands will." He walked back to the anvil and picked up his hammer. The steel bar on the coals was nearly ready, its center glowing yellow. Soon it would be shaped into a cuisse, a thigh guard. It would require curves, grooves, flexibility, and strength. A dozen tools would touch it before the day was out, none of them glorious, all of them necessary. With practiced motion, Oswin pulled the metal from the forge and laid it on the anvil. The first hammer strike rang out like a bell. The workshop echoed with the sound, not just of labor, but of ritual. Each clang was guided not by strength alone, but by the tools, trusted, worn, beloved. And in that harmony between man, steel, and instrument, a piece of armor began to live. But steel does not yield easily. It resists. It groans. It remembers its origin in the stubborn bones of the earth. Shaping it is a contest of will, between fire and force, between knowledge and instinct. Oswin had been shaping steel for over 2 decades, and still, he treated it not as a servant, but as a wary partner. The forge hissed and growled behind him, exhaling smoke through the flue. Outside, the world had risen. Women called to children, carts rumbled over muddy cobbles, and the church bell had tolled twice. But inside Oswin's smithy, the only time that mattered was measured in color. The dull red of a warming bar, the bright orange of ready steel, and the blinding white that meant danger. This morning, he was working on a breastplate, a commission from a local reeve, one of the wealthier men in town. Not a noble, but close enough to think himself one. He had requested something elegant but stout, which, in the language of armor, meant strong enough to stop a blade, but flashy enough to impress during parades. A poor combination. Oswin had accepted the job with a quiet nod and a hidden sigh. The steel plate he worked with now had already been cut roughly to size. It lay flat on the anvil like a cold promise. Soon, it would take the shape of a man's chest, a ridge down the center, curves over the ribs, flared sides for movement. But before any of that could happen, it had to be coaxed. He grasped the plate with thick tongs, the jaws biting into the edge like iron teeth. With one hand, he moved it into the fire. The coals whispered as the steel sank deeper. Wymond, standing at the bellows, pumped gently, feeding the forge's hunger. Oswin watched the color. That was the first secret of shaping. Steel spoke through light. When it glowed a gentle red, it was warm but lazy. When it burned orange, it was alert. When it shone yellow-white, it was alive, pliable, vulnerable, perfect for striking. He pulled the glowing sheet from the fire and laid it across a curved stake. With a swift motion, he raised the hammer. The first blow was gentle, more a conversation than a command. The second, firmer. By the third, sparks flew. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythm was everything. Steel did not respond well to hesitation. A clumsy strike could warp the plate, crack its surface, or introduce unseen stress. Oswin had learned this the hard way in his early days, when a single mistake had shattered a nearly finished greave. His master had made him start from scratch. He had not forgotten the lesson. Now, each blow landed with purpose. He was not just flattening, he was curving. As the plate bent over the stake, it began to resemble the human body, broad at the top, tapering toward the waist. Every man was different, but armor required standardization. Too tight, and it pinched. Too loose, and it shifted in battle. Oswin had measured the reeve's chest with a length of waxed cord, noting the girth and the slope of his shoulders. Those marks now guided his strikes. Wymond watched, wide-eyed, occasionally dabbing sweat from his brow. "Should I heat the next piece?" the boy asked. Oswin nodded. "Start the back plate." Wymond took the other sheet, a twin to the one Oswin worked, and began preparing it. Oswin allowed himself a small moment of pride. The boy was learning, not fast, but steady. As he worked, The steel began to resist, cooling now. Its glow faded to a dull amber. Time to reheat, back into the forge. As he waited, Oswin flexed his fingers. The hammer's vibration traveled through his wrist, up into his elbow. His muscles ached, but it was the ache of creation, the ache of control. He looked at the piece resting against the stake, partly formed, not yet elegant, but he could see it. He could always see the final shape before the first blow. That was another secret. An armorer had to hold the finished form in his mind from the first spark. The steel wouldn't show you what it wanted to be. You had to tell it. Wymond returned with the second piece, glowing and eager. "Set it there," Oswin said. "We'll need to match the curve." The back plate would need a spinal ridge, both for strength and aesthetics. Oswin used a fuller, placing the top and bottom halves on either side of the steel, then striking with practiced force. The groove formed slowly, like a river carved into rock. This wasn't just for show. That ridge added rigidity, helping the armor deflect strikes and hold its shape under pressure. He continued shaping both plates in alternating rounds. Reheat, strike, reheat. The fire was the rhythm, the hammer, the melody. At times, Wymond joined in with a second hammer, tapping where Oswin guided, helping to stretch the metal evenly. It was like playing a duet, and the music was thunder. Hours passed. By midday, the plates had taken their form. Still rough, edges sharp, but the bones were there. Oswin ran his hand along the breastplate's curve, feeling for inconsistencies. He set it next to the backplate, ensuring they would meet cleanly when joined by hinges and straps. They did. Not perfectly, but close. He quenched both in a barrel of oil. The liquid hissed as the hot metal sank. The cooling process hardened the steel, but it also made it brittle. Later, he would temper it, reheating at a lower temperature to restore some flexibility. For now, they sizzled like meat on a spit. Wymond stared into the barrel, fascinated. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "if we could shape it even more? Make it like the stories, smooth, perfect?" Oswin smiled. "Stories are told by poets. Armor is made by men." He lifted the steaming plate from the oil, blackened now, slick and smelling faintly of smoke and lard. Ugly to the eye, but it would shine after polishing. Beauty came last. The fire behind him crackled. The tools waited. The steel, newly born, rested in silence. Shaping steel was not about brute strength. It was about patience, listening, vision, and pain. Always pain. But Oswin didn't mind. Because in every curve, every groove, every clang that echoed from the anvil to the rafters, there was proof of life. Proof that something raw and unruly could be transformed into strength. And that, on the battlefield, or in the quiet corners of history, was worth the effort. The clang of the hammer fades now, and a different sound fills the smithy. The sharp tap-tap of the punch, the chink of a rivet falling into place, the click of metal meeting metal, not in combat, but in quiet assembly. It is afternoon. The fire, once roaring, now hums in the background. The breastplate and backplate Oswin had shaped earlier rest on a thick oak table, their surfaces dull and blackened from the quench, but already promising strength and form. Now comes a different kind of work. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less important. riveting. No piece of armor holds together without it. Oswin leans over the table, a magnifying lens strapped around his head, focusing his weary eyes on the fine work before him. His hands, scarred and blackened, move with the care of a monk illuminating scripture. Where the hammer had demanded force and rhythm, riveting demands precision. He holds up a small iron rivet between his fingers. It looks insignificant. A stub of metal, no larger than a thimble's mouth. But this, too, is armor. This tiny piece will bind plates that shield a man's heart. A poorly placed rivet can shear under pressure. Worse, it can shift, creating friction points, bruising the skin beneath the padding. Armor must not only protect, it must fit like a second skin, moving with the body, never against it. Oswin marks the breastplate with charcoal, 6 holes along the shoulder edge, spaced evenly, aligned with the matching holes on the backplate. He drills each hole using a hand-cranked brace fitted with a hardened bit. It groans a little as it bites into the tempered steel, shaving curls of metal like iron slivers. Wymond stands nearby, carefully oiling the bit between holes and brushing filings from the table. "Not too much oil," Oswin mutters. "We don't want it to slip." "Aye, master," Wymond replies, almost reverently. This, too, is a lesson. He watches more than he speaks now. He is learning the slow rhythm of fastening, the final stitching that gives armor its true shape. With the holes drilled and deburred, Oswin begins setting the rivets. He places the backplate on its edge, securing it with wooden clamps to keep it steady. Into the first hole, he slides the rivet from behind, its head resting against the steel. Then he aligns the breastplate over it, coaxing the plates together with soft, padded blows from a mallet until the holes kiss perfectly. The rivet pokes through both plates. Now, it must be peened. Oswin uses a rounded set hammer to mushroom the protruding end of the rivet, locking it in place. Each strike must be deliberate, enough to spread the metal, not so much as to crack it. The sound is softer than hammering hot steel, a muted tink, followed by the groan of compressed metal. When the head flattens into a neat, secure dome, Oswin taps it once more and runs his thumb over the edge. Smooth, secure, good. Test the joint, he says. Wymond lifts the joint plates. They pivot slightly, held together by the rivet, but not rigid. The movement is deliberate. Armor must flex with the body's twist and bend. Oswin nods. Now again. 5 more. And so they continue. Each rivet is a small victory. They work from the shoulders down to the sides, connecting back and breast, and then adding interior straps. Some are decorative, copper or brass, etched with tiny rings. These are used in visible places where armor meets cloth. Others are hidden, purely functional. Oswin does not skimp on those. No one ever died because their armor was too decorative, but many have bled because it wasn't strong. After a time, Wymond dares a question. Why not use larger rivets? Oswin glances up, amused. You want the knight to move, not clank like a mill cart? Large rivets bind too tight. These, he lifts one between soot-dark fingers. These flex just enough. Armor that doesn't move is a coffin. Wymond nods and returns to the table, reverent again. They finish joining the main plates, and Oswin turns to the hinges. These are special, small articulated joints that allow the armor to open like a door. Hinges are delicate work, not forged in the fire, but crafted at the bench with files and tiny chisels. He files one now, testing the pin that will hold the barrel in place. It slides in smoothly, with just enough tension to resist falling out. With the hinges installed, the armor can open and close across the chest. A leather strap across the side, buckled tight, will hold it snug. These buckles, Oswin made them himself from rolled bronze. He considers buying ready-made ones from the Tanner's Guild, but they are never quite right. Too soft, too thin. He doesn't trust another man's buckle to hold when an arrow strikes the shoulder. By late afternoon, the armor is assembled. It doesn't look like much yet. Blackened, greasy, pinned and riveted like a stitched beast. But it moves. Hinges swing, plates flex. Oswin lifts it and sets it on a wooden dummy. A rough carving in the shape of a man. The armor hugs the form closely, gaps only where gaps are needed. Wymond watches it like it's a living thing. In a way, it is. Oswin steps back and crosses his arms. "Tomorrow we'll polish it," he says. "Then line the inside." Wymond smiles, tired but proud. "It's nearly done." Oswin doesn't smile, but he nods. "Nearly, but a knight will wear this into battle. It has to be more than good. It has to be invisible. It has to be perfect." He touches one of the rivets again, still warm from the hammer, small, unassuming, but vital. These are the stitches of war, he thinks, the unseen threads of survival. Outside, the sun slips lower. The smithy glows with twilight and the soft heat of dying coals. The breastplate glints faintly in the fading light, like a promise half kept. Tomorrow, they will burnish it to a mirror shine. But tonight, Oswin is content. The armor is whole. The fastenings hold. And the silence of evening means it has not failed. By the time the morning fog has retreated into the hedgerows and the scent of damp hay lingers in the air, Oswin is already at the workbench, cloth in hand. The armor lies before him, whole now, the shape of a man etched into steel. It gleams only faintly under the beams of the workshop, its surface dulled by the smoke of the forge and the grime of labor. But today is not for hammering, not for fire, not for noise. Today is for refinement, polishing. This is the quiet work, the final passage between creation and completion. And like all things Oswin does, it begins with ritual. He pulls out a shallow wooden box filled with soft abrasives, chalk powder, powdered pumice, a leather strop rubbed with wax and tallow. Another box holds cloths, linen torn from old smocks, strips of wool, pads made from wrapped horsehair. Nearby rests a whetstone, smooth and cool, though that is mostly for edges, not plates. A third box holds paste made from vinegar and fine sand, blended with ash and rendered fat. The smell is strong, but clean, and it stings the nose in a familiar way. Oswin sets the breastplate on a padded bench. It still bears the black smudges of fire along its seams, like soot-fingered ghosts. He dips a cloth into the paste and begins rubbing it into the metal in slow, even circles. The motion is rhythmic, almost meditative. Wymond watches, silent for once. He has begun to understand that polishing is not just about looks. It is the final proof of a craftsman's care. A poor polish betrays haste, laziness, or ignorance. It allows rust to take hold, unnoticed. It makes edges sharper than they should be. causing pain to the wearer. It screams of shortcuts. A knight trusts what he can see, Oswin says, not pausing in his work. He doesn't know how it was forged, but if he sees his face in it, he believes it will protect him. He presses harder into the plate, the muscles in his arm flexing. The dull surface begins to bloom, slowly, like a hidden moon rising from shadow. Under the paste, a sheen begins to form, subtle at first, then clearer. Oswin reaches for a fresh cloth, dry this time, and buffs the plate with quick, firm strokes. The polish grows brighter. The fire stains recede. Wymond takes the backplate and begins to mimic the motion. His strokes are uneven at first, too slow in some places, too hurried in others. Even pressure, Oswin instructs. No streaks. You're not wiping a table. You're revealing the steel beneath. The apprentice nods, adjusts his grip, and continues. Outside, the town is stirring. Hooves clatter on cobblestones. A crier bellows the day's proclamations. News from Calais. Taxes from London. Someone down the lane is repairing a shutter, and the sharp whack of wood meets iron rings through the still air. But in the smithy, the world narrows to the width of a gauntlet, the curve of a gorget. Polishing takes hours, and not just on the outside. Oswin turns each piece in his hands, cuirass, vambrace, tasset, bevor. He runs his fingers along every inner seam, searching for burrs or sharp ridges. These must be filed or smoothed. A rough edge inside a helm can cut a scalp open during a charge. An overlooked notch near the armpit can tear a gambeson sleeve or pinch the flesh beneath. He works with a file and a small rasp, murmuring to himself as he grinds away invisible dangers. These are the refinements no knight will ever see. But Oswin knows, the armor is not a statue to be admired. It must be worn, trusted. It must move as the man moves, flow like water, but strike like stone. By midday, the pieces gleam like river stones under sunlight, not mirror bright. Oswin has no need for vanity polish, but they shine nonetheless. He inspects each surface from several angles, checking for streaks, smudges, uneven patches. He lifts the breastplate and looks into it. His reflection stares back, distorted by the curvature, but unmistakable. The gray in his beard, the crease in his brow, the soot smudged on one cheek. He wipes the spot clean and moves on. Next come the edges, polished, then lightly waxed to resist moisture. Oswin prepares a mixture of beeswax and animal fat, warmed gently over coals, then applies it with a cloth. The wax leaves a faint sheen and a faint scent. Sweet, earthy, solid. Smells like the summer hives, Wymond says, smiling. Oswin nods. Better that than rust. Wax feeds the steel. The final touch is the maker's mark, a small punch shaped like a tree with 5 roots and a crescent moon above. Oswin places it at the bottom edge of the backplate, visible only when the armor is off. He aligns it carefully and strikes once with a hammer. Chink. The symbol is there now. Delicate, clean, unmistakable. That's you, Wymond asks. That's the work, Oswin replies. He picks up the armor and lays it piece by piece on the wooden dummy once again. The polished steel catches the afternoon light and scatters it across the smithy walls. It glows like something made for legend, not war. But Oswin knows better. This armor will ride under banners, It will charge across muddy fields into rain and blood and screaming. It will be dented, perhaps broken, but for now, for this one moment, it is perfect. The armor has become something more than its parts. It is no longer plate, strap, rivet, polish. It is readiness, silent and gleaming. Oswin wipes his hands and steps back. Wymond does the same. "Is it done?" the boy asks. Oswin studies it for a long moment. Then he nods. "It is," he says. "For now." The armor stands complete, polished, assembled, ready. Yet it waits. Not for battle, not for glory, but for its wearer. Oswin knows that forging is only half the work. A suit of armor, no matter how finely hammered or polished, must fit. Otherwise, it is a coffin made of iron. Outside, the soft clatter of hooves draws nearer. Through the small front window, Oswin glimpses the blue and crimson surcoat of Sir Aldrich of Harwood, a lesser knight sworn to the Earl of Pembroke. He rides a stout bay gelding and carries himself with the upright pride of a man unused to doing anything himself, not even dismounting. A boy follows behind, no older than 12, who scurries to hold the reins. Oswin steps into the yard, wiping his hands on a leather cloth. "Master Oswin," Sir Aldrich calls, slipping from the saddle with practiced grace. He wears a padded gambeson under his cloak, the laces of his arming doublet already partly fastened. "Is it ready?" Oswin nods. "It waits for you, sir." Inside, the armor gleams on the wooden dummy. Sir Aldrich circles it slowly, the way a falcon eyes a rabbit, half admiration, half appraisal. "The lines are clean," he says at last. "You remembered the fluting down the tassets." "Aye," Oswin replies, "to match your last brigandine." Sir Aldrich lifts the gauntlet from the table and flexes the fingers. The leather lining creaks. "Light," he mutters, almost surprised, "as light as steel allows. Shall we begin?" The knight strips off his cloak and doublet, revealing a sleeveless linen shirt damp with sweat despite the coolness of the stone floor. Beneath it, he wears a padded arming coat, quilted, thick, and stiff with years of use. It bears stains that no laundress can scrub out. Rust, blood, salt. Oswin nods in approval. It's worn, but honest. Wymond carries the first piece over, the cuisses, jointed plates that will protect the thighs. Sir Aldrich lifts one leg after the other, letting Oswin fasten the straps snug around the arming points. They adjust the greaves next, covering the shins, then the sabatons, metal shoes that curl slightly at the toes like the fashionable poulons, though far more deadly. Each piece is affixed carefully, strapped tight yet allowing freedom. Oswin's fingers move with the precision of decades, cinching, adjusting, tightening, listening. A good fit makes no sound. A bad one creaks, groans, or worse, binds at the joint. The knight's face changes as the armor mounts his frame. First curiosity, then satisfaction, finally, confidence. "Feels right," he says, rolling his shoulder as Oswin fastens the rear brace over his right arm. "It's meant to. You move, it moves with you." Sir Aldrich swings his arm in a circle, then bends it. The elbow counter sits perfectly, not pinching or sliding. A small, pleased grunt escapes his lips. The fitting continues. The breastplate is next, shaped like an hourglass, flared at the waist, with faint lines down the center to deflect blows. It settles onto his chest with a muted clank, the straps snapping into place with practiced ease. Over the shoulders go the pauldrons, layered plates protecting the collarbone and upper arms. Oswin adjusts them so they don't rise too high or sag, ensuring they won't interfere with drawing a sword or lifting a shield. "Flex your back," Oswin says. Sir Aldrich does so. Again? Good. He slips the bavor into place next, just below the jawline. It clasps against the gorget, shielding the throat without pressing it. Finally, the helmet, a bassinet with a hinged visor, forged from a single plate of steel. Oswin lowers it over the knight's head, secures the chin strap, and gives the visor a gentle push. It lifts smoothly, clicks into place, then shuts again with a clean snap. "Can you breathe?" "Like a dragon," Aldrich replies, the voice echoing faintly through the vent holes. Oswin steps back. The knight is now fully encased. The transformation is stark. Moments ago, he had looked like a man, a strong one perhaps, but mortal. Now, encased in steel, he is something else, impenetrable, unyielding, a golem shaped by hand and fire. He takes a few steps around the room. The armor clinks softly, more a whisper than a rattle. He crouches, rises, swings his arms. Nothing binds, nothing chafes. He lifts his visor and grins. Feels like wearing a second skin. "It is," Oswin says simply. That's the aim. But Oswin knows what's unspoken, that this skin can become a prison if even one buckle breaks or one hinge stiffens, and that under all that metal, the flesh is still soft, still breakable. Sir Aldrich doesn't think of this. Few knights do. He reaches for his sword, hanging near the door. In a single motion, he draws and slashes at the air. The blade whistles as it cuts a line through the light. Oswin notes how the shoulder plates move, how the arms rotate. There is no drag, no catching. "Perfect," Aldrich says. "Truly." He sheathes the sword, then holds out a gauntleted hand. Oswin grips it, feeling the weight of steel between them. "I'll send payment before the week is out," the knight says, "and if this armor saves me come Michaelmas, I'll send my cousin to you for his fitting. He's due to squire this spring." Oswin inclines his head. "My thanks." With Wyman's help, Sir Aldrich removes the armor piece by piece, sweat dampening the arming coat beneath. Each plate is placed carefully on a linen wrap, which the squire begins to fold into a bundle for transport. The shine of the steel dims slightly in the shifting light, but Oswin knows it will hold. As the knight mounts his horse once more, he gives one last glance back toward the workshop. "You've built me a shell worthy of battle, Oswin," he says. "I only hope the man inside can prove as strong." Oswin does not reply. He merely watches as the knight rides away, his shadow long on the cobbles. Back inside, Wymond begins sweeping. Oswin sits down, wiping his hands on a cloth already blackened with grime. He looks at the empty bench where the armor had lain. The light dances there now, quiet again. But he knows the work lives on someone else's back now. Out in the world, steel will meet sword, and his hands, through it, will answer. The afternoon had begun to sink toward evening, and the forge had grown quieter. The heat of the morning fire still lingered, but the flames had been banked to glowing embers. Oswin was bent over his workbench, his back a mountain of knotted muscle beneath his sweat-darkened tunic, his thick fingers adjusting the fine hinges on a bevor for a new commission. Outside, the town carried on as usual. The cry of merchants, the clatter of hooves on stone, the occasional raucous laugh of a drunk near the tavern. He didn't notice the visitor until the bell above his door gave a timid jingle. Not the bold clang of a knight entering, not the bashful shuffle of a messenger. This was deliberate, cautious. Oswin looked up, expecting perhaps a noble's steward or a boy with a repair order. What he saw made him pause. The figure in the doorway wore a cloak too long for travel and too clean for work. Dust clung to the hem, but the hands were delicate, clean and pale, unused to hammer or plow. A hood was pulled low over the face, but from beneath it peeked a glimpse of fine blonde braid, coiled and pinned neatly. When the hood came down, Oswin was not surprised to see a woman, but he was surprised at her eyes. They were sharp, observant, not curious, but calculating. "Good day," she said. Her voice was precise, well-bred. "Are you Oswin, Master Armorer?" "I am," he said, straightening. "And you?" She stepped forward, the smell of lavender trailing faintly behind her. She looked to be in her mid-20s, though the confidence in her posture made her seem older. Her hands were gloved, soft kidskin, and she held a small linen-wrapped bundle in the crook of her arm. "My name is Lady Sabine of Loxwell," she said. "My brother said you could be trusted." Oswin blinked. Loxwell. That name rang faintly. Border gentry, if he recalled. Not landed high nobility, but not peasants either. The sort of family who might own a small estate and owe service to a greater lord. He'd worked with their kind before. "And what is it you need, my lady?" he asked, wiping his hands on a cloth and gesturing toward the bench. "We've little time before supper, but I'll hear it." She hesitated, then crossed to the table and slowly unwrapped the bundle. Within was a small steel plate, shaped and partially finished. Perhaps a gorget, Oswin guessed, but not quite right. The curves were too shallow, the edges rough, the rivets unevenly spaced. "I made this," she said, watching his face closely. Oswin looked at her, then at the piece again. It wasn't bad. In fact, it was better than most journeymen could manage on their first dozen tries. "You've skill?" he said finally. "I've had access to my father's smithy since I was a child. I began with horseshoes and hinges, then buckles. I've only recently started armor. And you want me to teach you?" She didn't flinch. "Yes." Oswin leaned back on his heels. In truth, he had no particular prejudice against women working iron. He'd known a few widows who had taken up their husbands' tools out of necessity, and a few others, fierce, broad-shouldered women in town, who had helped with bellows and charcoal making. But to have a noble-born woman in his forge, among coal and sweat and curses, that was another matter. "I don't take apprentices lightly," he said. "I'm not asking to be coddled. I know the work. I've bled for it." She held out her hands, gloved still. At his nod, she pulled them off. Her palms were marred with blisters, both fresh and healed. Her fingernails were torn and black at the edges. She met his gaze squarely. "I don't want to make trinkets. I want to make armor. Good armor. Better than my brothers wear." Why? It was a simple question, but it carried weight. She hesitated a moment, then said, "Because I've seen what happens when it fails." A silence fell. Outside, the bells tolled for vespers. Oswin slowly turned the gorget over in his hands. "There's more to this trade than hammer and steel," he said. "There's waiting, listening, knowing where the pressure lies, where to give and where to take. Most days are dull, and the good ones end with blisters and backache." "I know. Do you?" he asked, arching a brow. "Do you know how long it takes to set a rivet clean, or how a poorly tempered plate can kill a man?" "I will," she said, "if you let me stay." He studied her. She had the look of someone who wouldn't stop, either until she succeeded or until the world broke her trying. Finally, he gestured toward a stool in the corner of the room. "You can observe. For now. You speak when I ask. You do what I say, exactly how I say it. No pride, no complaints." She sat immediately, a quiet tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Wymond came in just then with a bucket of fresh water and paused, glancing between the unfamiliar woman and his master. Oswin said nothing, just jerked his chin toward the forge. "Time to heat the breastplate," he said. "We've work." As the fire roared back to life, and the first piece of steel was placed upon the coals, Oswin felt the odd stirrings of something unfamiliar. He wasn't sure yet if it was foolishness or foresight. But as Lady Sabine of Loxwell watched every movement, her eyes gleaming in the firelight, he suspected this day might be the start of something different. Not bad. Not yet. Just unexpected. Sir Edric of Blackwood arrived on a gray afternoon, thunder muttering far to the north like a warning. His steed, mud-flecked and lean from long travel, clattered down Linstead's narrow street, sending chickens flapping into doorways and children scattering from their game of stones. He rode with the stiff-backed posture of a man born into privilege, but worn down by years of battle and expectations. His armor, once polished to a knightly gleam, was dulled by dried blood, cracked leather, and dents the size of a man's fist. Oswin heard him before he saw him. The off-kilter clink of misaligned plates, the metallic cough of a weakened cuirass strap, the sound of pride damaged, not just armor. The forge door creaked open, and in stepped the knight, tall even without his helm, his face shadowed with stubble and sun. His tabard bore a faded boar's head, Blackwood's crest, but it hung limp like a banner in retreat. "You Oswin the armorer?" he asked, voice like gravel dragged over stone. "I am," Oswin replied, setting aside a greave he had been reshaping. "And you've seen better campaigns." The knight gave a mirthless grunt and unbuckled the battered cuirass, letting it drop onto Oswin's workbench with a thud. "The Battle of Fenmere," he said. "We won, if that's what you'd call it. I took a mace to the chest. The armor held. My breath did not." Oswin ran his fingers along the front of the cuirass. The steel was warped, bowing inward like a bell struck hard. Cracks spidered near the shoulder rivets, where the metal had taken too much strain. A lesser plate would have shattered. "This was good work once," Oswin said. "It was yours," Edric answered. Oswin looked up, surprised. The knight's expression hadn't changed, but there was something beneath the surface, a quiet respect. 15 years ago. the knight continued. I was a page then. My father had it made for me when I first squired. Still wearing it. Foolish, stubborn, Oswin said, but not foolish. He lifted the cuirass with care, as if it were a wounded beast. Sabine and Wymond watched from the corner, silent. The damage was clear. The front plate was compromised, and the backplate straps had rotted near the buckle. It was still armor, but just barely. I can mend it, Oswin said, but it won't be what it was. I don't want it new, Edric said, setting his helm beside it. I want it mine. There was a silence then, not awkward, but heavy, the kind of stillness that came when men spoke honestly, not with their words, but with what they chose to preserve. Oswin nodded. He began the work that evening, as the rain came at last. Soft at first, then steady. The forge hissed when droplets slipped through the thatch and struck hot iron, but Oswin worked through it. Wymond kept the fire stoked. Sabine prepared strips of boiled leather for replacement straps. First, Oswin removed the damaged rivets, one by one. Some snapped under pressure, brittle from rust. Others had to be pried with a cold chisel. He set them aside carefully. Each had once held pride in place. He reforged the dented front plate over the horn of his anvil, heating it to a dull orange before striking it with heavy blows. The steel protested. Old metal did, but it yielded in time, reshaping beneath his hammer to a smoother curve. Not perfect, but strong. As the hours passed, Oswin found himself thinking of the knight, not as a noble, not as a client, but as a man. To wear the same armor for 15 years, through squirehood, knighthood, and war, was to carry history on your skin. Each scratch, a campaign. Each dent, a duel. Each repair, a decision not to replace, but to endure. When the plate was cooled, he polished it with oil and sandstone, careful not to erase the scars completely. Some memories, he thought, are best left visible. Next came the straps. Sabine measured and cut them with practiced hands, her stitching firm and even. She worked silently, lips pursed in focus, though Oswin could tell she was thinking about more than leather. Wymond prepared fresh rivets, lining them up neatly in the order they'd be needed. By dawn, the armor was whole again. Sir Edric returned just as the first light touched the forge's windows. He stepped inside, rain still clinging to his shoulders. He said nothing at first, only stared at the cuirass laid out on the bench. It's not new, Oswin said quietly. But it's ready? Edric approached and ran a gloved hand over the chest plate. His eyes lingered on the reworked curve, on the repaired straps. She'll ride again, he murmured. Oswin nodded. She will. But Edric didn't lift the armor. Instead, he looked around the forge. The hammers hung like church bells, the anvil etched with years of toil, the apprentice and noblewoman working side by side. You remember me then? The knight asked. Barely, Oswin admitted. You were all bone and bravado. And now? Still bravado, Oswin said with a faint smirk, but the bones buried deeper. The knight chuckled, a sound like dry wood cracking. I nearly died in Fenmere. he said, softer now. But it wasn't the mace that undid me. It was the fear that my armor wouldn't hold. When it did, I realized something. I trusted your hand more than my sword. Oswin said nothing. Praise, when spoken honestly, had a weight to it. The knight buckled the cuirass on slowly, the straps creaking new but snug. He flexed, tested the fit. He moved toward the doorway, light pooling behind him. "What do I owe you?" he asked. Oswin shrugged. "You paid already, 15 years ago." The knight paused, then removed a small item from his belt pouch, a boar's headpin made of silver and black enamel. "Then take this," he said, "for your apprentice, when he's ready." Oswin accepted it without protest, a small thing, but heavy. Sir Edric mounted his horse and rode off through the damp street, armor clinking truer now. Not perfect, but proud. Inside the forge, Oswin turned to Wymond. "Lesson for the day?" Wymond blinked, caught off guard. "Don't ride into battle in worn straps?" Oswin smiled faintly. "Close. The right repair can carry a man further than the sharpest sword." And with that, the hammer rang once more, echoing not just through iron, but through memory. The dawn that broke over Linstead was silver and sharp, as if the morning had been forged like a blade. The fog lifted slowly over the tilled fields, where rooks perched like judges on the fence posts. Oswin was already at the forge, fire breathing low and steady, when the first knock came. Not at the front door, but on the side gate. It was Aldrich, the reeve of the village, short of breath and red in the cheeks. "They're here," he said, not bothering with greeting. "All 15 of them. And some have brought brothers." Oswin sighed, not out of annoyance, but in anticipation. He wiped his soot-covered hands on a bit of linen and looked out toward the lane. Sure enough, a gaggle of men stood awkwardly near the fence. Farmers, shepherds, a brewer's son, still in stained linen. Not one of them wore more than a padded jack, and some looked like they hadn't ever held more than a pitchfork in anger. The militia was assembling. King Edward had sent the summons 3 months prior. Every town and manor must provide fighting men for the crown's defense. Trouble was stirring again in France, and though no one in Linstead truly believed they'd see Calais, they obeyed. The reeve selected his strongest, youngest, and most broad-shouldered, and now they needed armor. Not knightly plate, but enough to stop a blade and hold dignity. "Right, let's begin," Oswin muttered. He stepped outside, nodding once at the gathered men. They stared at him like children waiting for a scolding. "You're not soldiers," he said plainly. "You're farmers, masons, brewers. But if you wear armor, real armor, you'll carry more than protection. You'll carry the look of men worth fearing." A few shifted on their feet, unsure if that was a compliment. Oswin turned and pointed to the open barn beside the forge. Inside, 6 gambesons hung from beams, sleeves stuffed with straw to hold their shape. Beside them, kettle helmets, brigandines, and mismatched greaves salvaged from old orders or unfinished commissions. "These aren't new. They're not pretty," Oswin said. "But they'll keep your ribs in your chest and your blood inside your skin." He beckoned them forward, one by one. First was Tam the butcher's boy, broad as a cart horse and just as gentle. Oswin fitted him with a patched brigandine, iron plates riveted inside layers of cloth, and cinched it at the sides. It sagged slightly on his left, and Oswin wedged an extra layer of felt beneath the shoulder. "Move," Oswin commanded. Tam obeyed, lifting his arms, swinging left, then right. "Good. That'll do. You'll take a beating before you bleed." Next came Geraint, the cobbler's apprentice, lanky and with ears that turned red in the cold. Oswin gave him a leather jack reinforced with metal studs and paired it with a nasal helmet missing its plume socket. He looked ridiculous, but his eyes gleamed with something Oswin recognized: fear, barely covered by pride. So it went, man after man, each with different measurements, different temperaments. Oswin didn't have enough proper plate to go around, but he made up for it with layering: linen over leather, mail scraps sewn onto old padding. Sabine helped with the fitting, her fingers nimble and sure as she adjusted straps and hammered rivets. Wymond moved like a restless dog, carrying gauntlets, fetching tools, adjusting buckles. By noon, the forge yard looked like a battlefield of its own. Bits of old armor strewn across benches, strips of cloth and boiled leather soaking in buckets, soot caking every exposed surface. Oswin called a halt. The men sat in the grass, removing helmets to gulp water and chew rough bread. Their conversation was hushed but alive. Shoulder pieces that pinched, helmets too loose, the awkward shuffle of greaves around ankles. It reminded Oswin of a memory long buried. He'd been 16, just past his journeyman years, when the sheriff had summoned every craftsman in Linstead to prepare for a rumored Welsh incursion. Oswin had stood in a padded jack too big for his frame, holding a hammer he barely knew how to swing in combat. He hadn't fought that day, no attack ever came, but the fear stayed with him. Now, decades later, he watched men preparing not for glory, but for duty. They didn't speak of conquest. They didn't boast. They wore their armor not like knights, but like fathers protecting homes. After the break, Oswin continued with adjustments. He showed them how to buckle a backplate properly, how to pad a helmet with wool so it wouldn't ring like a bell when struck. He demonstrated the trick of layering a gambeson sleeve beneath a spalder for freer movement. No detail was too small. "You may not fight," he said, addressing them as a group. "But if you do, your armor is not just for the blow you see. It's for the one you never notice until after." A silence followed. Then Tam raised a hand. "What if it breaks?" "Then you patch it," Oswin replied. "You live through the first blow. You can worry about the second." The men nodded. By late afternoon, the sun began its descent. The group stood in a line now, looking like some odd parody of an army. No uniform colors, no banners, just a line of men with dented helms and uneven cuirasses. But they stood taller. The reeve arrived, nodding at the sight. "They're ready." "As they'll ever be," Oswin said. The men would train in the fields in the coming weeks. They'd march awkwardly, fumble swords and pole arms, and forget half the drills, but they'd march with steel over their hearts. And that mattered. As the militia dispersed, Oswin remained at the forge, scrubbing ash from his hands. Sabine packed the scraps. Wymond returned tools to their places. The yard grew quiet again, as if the day had exhaled. Later, Oswin sat by the forge, sipping weak ale. His hands ached. His back stiffened. But he was satisfied. He hadn't made knights. He'd made men into something more than villagers. He'd given them the steel of belief, the weight of readiness. Meanwhile, the male hauberk was a wreck when it arrived. It came bundled in a sack that stank of sweat, rust, and something worse. Blood, dried and caked into the links like a second skin. Women set it down on the workbench with both hands, wincing as the weight of it clunked against the oak. "From the garrison," he grunted. "They said it belonged to a footman who took a pike in the ribs." Oswin didn't speak immediately. He'd seen it all before. Smashed helms, split cuirasses, punctured tassets. But chainmail was a different beast. Unlike plate, which could be reshaped or reforged, mail was a tapestry. A metal fabric of thousands of interlocking rings, each one dependent on the next. Break one, and it was a flaw. Break 10, and it was a wound. Break 50, and it was a question of whether it was worth salvaging at all. He untied the sack and pulled the hauberk free. A heavy shirt of darkened links spilled onto the bench like a collapsed skeleton. Part of the left side had been torn open, jagged, twisted links curling outward like broken vines. Oswin grimaced. "Look at this," he murmured. Wymond leaned closer. "They said a pike?" Oswin asked. The boy nodded. "Didn't just pierce. It caught. Yanked sideways. That's why it tore like this." He fingered the ruined edge, letting the rings slide between his calloused fingertips. Each was about the width of a penny, riveted shut, most likely 4-in-1 pattern. Each ring linked through 4 others. Classic Norman style. Laborious, but strong. And still used all across England and the continent by those who couldn't afford full plate. "Did he live?" Oswin asked quietly. Wymond hesitated. "They didn't say." Oswin sighed. Then he didn't. He pulled up a stool and set to work. First, the hauberk had to be cleaned. He filled a basin with vinegar and water and dropped the damaged portion in. It fizzed slightly, rust hissing against the acid. He took a stiff-bristled brush and scrubbed gently, loosening dirt and dried blood. His hands moved slowly, with practiced care. He didn't look away. Working with mail required full attention. One missed ring could weaken a whole square inch of defense. Wymond watched, chin in hand. "You'll be doing this one day," Oswin said. "You need to learn the pattern." 4-in-1, Wymond recited dutifully. 1 ring through 4 others. Not always. There's 6-in-1, 8-in-1, but 4 is most common. Strongest for the weight. He reached for a wooden bowl beside the bench and shook it gently. Dozens of tiny, shining rings jingled inside. They were handmade, drawn wire looped around a mandrel, then clipped into rings and punched for rivets. Sabine had made most of them. Her hands were smaller and more patient than his. He took one out, pinched it open with tongs, and slid it into place, connecting 4 surrounding links like weaving thread through cloth. Then he set the rivet with a tiny hammer tap. "Over 200 rings are damaged," Oswin muttered. "Won't take all day, but close to it." As the morning wore on, the shop filled with the soft clinks of rings shifting, the occasional sharp tap of rivet setting, and the steady breath of two people who understood that time and steel often worked together in silence. It was tedious work, but not meaningless. Every link added was another step toward usefulness, toward protection for the next soul to wear it. Wymond grew bored eventually and fetched bread and apples from the larder. Oswin didn't stop. He thought, as he worked, about the unknown man who'd worn this hauberk. A footman, likely conscripted, poor, wore this mail in a battle not his own, took a pike in the ribs, and died without a name crossing the lips of the soldier who delivered the armor. There was an unspoken bond in a repaired hauberk. The new rings, slightly shinier than the old, marked the story. They were not meant to hide the damage, but to restore what had been broken. Oswin had once likened it to mending a net after a storm. Some would discard it, but the wiser ones knew that only a fool threw away something, simply because it had been hurt. By noon, the left side had been repaired. Oswin held it up to the light. The new links glinted. Not pretty, not seamless, but functional, strong. "That'll hold," he said aloud. Wymond nodded, eyes wide. "Think I can try a few?" Oswin hesitated. Then he pulled a square of damaged mail from his scrap pile and laid it down. "Try this. Clean it first. Same pattern." Wymond dove in eagerly. Oswin watched him for a moment, awkward, slow, but careful. Then he returned to the hauberk. There were still a few gashes along the hem and some worn spots under the arms. Mail took strain in strange places, where arms rubbed, where belts rode up, where weight shifted unexpectedly in the press of battle. He kept working into the afternoon, pausing only to drink or stretch his shoulders. Sabine passed through, glanced at the progress, and nodded approvingly. She always liked mail repairs. She said they reminded her of lace. "Looks like you're sewing metal," she once said. "A warrior's embroidery." By evening, the hauberk was whole, not new, but honest. The links were slightly mismatched in color, some darker with age, others bright as spring steel. But together, they held. They would hold again. Oswin folded it carefully and set it on a clean cloth. He would return it to the garrison in the morning. They would assign it to another poor soul, someone who might live or die with his work between blade and bone. He ran a hand over the mail one last time. "Not all armor is grand," he whispered, "but all armor matters." In the corner, Wymond had completed his small patch. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. The boy beamed. "Good," Oswin said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to draw wire. Then we'll make our own links." Wymond lit up. Oswin looked once more at the repaired hauberk. So many men lived and died with only this between them and the void. No gilded breastplate, no crested helm, just links and labor, and a smith's quiet dedication. And as the forge cooled and night returned, the mail glinted softly in the lamplight, testament to the patience and purpose behind every ring. The next day was the kind of morning where even the forge seemed reluctant to wake. Rain drizzled from the leaden sky, turning the dirt road into thick, sucking mud, and the scent of damp wool hung heavy in the air. Oswin stood beneath the overhang of his smithy's entrance, arms crossed against the chill, watching the village slip into its sluggish routine. The usual rhythms of life, the baker's smoke, the tanner's foul fumes, were muffled beneath the weight of the weather. He would have gladly spent the day repairing a helm or tending his tools, but fate, as it often did, had other plans. Just after the church bell rang prime, the jangle of tack and the dull thud of hooves on wet ground heralded a visitor. Oswin squinted through the rain to see a tall figure dismounting from a glossy destrier. The man wore no heraldic sigil, just a hooded cloak of dark green trimmed with subtle silver threading. A squire trailed behind, struggling with a wooden chest as wide as his shoulders. "Are you Oswin, the armorer?" the man asked, his voice low, almost gravelly. "I am," Oswin replied cautiously, eyeing the chest. The visitor nodded and stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Rain dripped from his cloak, but he moved with a deliberate grace, used to command, yet careful. Oswin closed the door behind him and turned to find the stranger already standing near the workbench, examining the tools with interest. "I've been told you value discretion," the man said. Oswin nodded slowly. "Discretion costs silver. I trust you're prepared." The squire placed the chest on the floor with a grunt and withdrew. The nobleman, or whoever he truly was, opened the lid and turned it toward Oswin. Inside was not coin, but armor. Not just any armor. This was Italian, Milanese plate, forged and polished with such precision it practically gleamed in the dim light of the forge. Oswin felt a shiver, not of cold, but of recognition. He had only seen armor like this twice in his life, once in London, worn by a visiting Venetian captain, and once more, years ago, during a tournament attended by princes. "You want me to copy it?" Oswin asked, stepping forward with a reverence he rarely showed. "No," the man said. "I want it modified." Oswin frowned. Why would anyone alter this? It's perfect. The stranger's lips twitched into the hint of a smile. Because perfection is often predictable. I need the look of Milanese plate, with slight innovations. Less visible joints here, he pointed, and additional reinforcement here, and a concealed space in the gorget. Another hidden compartment. Oswin felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. That sort of work is delicate, risky. "I will pay triple your standard rate," the man said, producing a pouch from his cloak and dropping it onto the workbench. The silver coins inside clinked with a satisfying weight. Wymond, who had just entered, gawked at the pile. "I'll need a fortnight," Oswin said. "You'll have 10 days. The man offered a gloved hand. Oswin grasped it, feeling calloused fingers. Odd for a noble. Not a courtly knight, then. A soldier. A real one. "Who do you fight for?" Oswin asked, unable to stop himself. The man met his eyes, calm and unreadable. "For what's coming." Then he turned and left, cloak billowing, leaving rain and silence behind. The next 10 days passed in a blur of secrecy and steel. Oswin closed the shop to all but the most trusted locals, claiming illness. In truth, he worked dawn to dusk on the modifications. The armor's craftsmanship was exquisite. Each plate tempered perfectly, the curves flowing with elegance. It felt almost sacrilegious to alter it. Yet Oswin began with slow, reverent care. He reinforced the left vambrace with an inner liner of hardened leather, light but strong. He replaced the rivets on the shoulder plates with hollow pins, allowing faster removal in an emergency. Most importantly, he designed the concealed compartment beneath the gorget, accessible only by pressing a cleverly disguised stud behind the neck. Wymond worked silently beside him, his eyes wide with awe as he handled the foreign pieces. "Who do you think he is?" the boy asked one evening. Oswin didn't look up. "Someone who plays a larger game." "But what kind of man needs hidden compartments in every piece of armor?" Oswin paused, his hammer hovering over the rivet. "A man who knows he might not survive, but wants to make sure something does." They worked through the nights, sleeping in shifts, keeping the forge's heart warm and the door bolted tight. Oswin found himself growing attached to the pieces, partly out of admiration, partly out of the sheer mystery. He wondered more than once whether this man served the king or opposed him, whether he rode with the March Lords or with the rebels whispered about in taverns. On the 10th day, just as the misty dusk fell over the village, the man returned. No squire this time, no chest, just the hooded figure, silent and watchful. Oswin presented the armor in sections, explaining each modification. The man asked no questions. He tested each piece briefly, then nodded. Finally, he reached for the gorget, pressed the stud Oswin had hidden, and the compartment clicked open without sound. "Impressive," the man murmured. "Let's hope you don't need to use it," Oswin replied. For a moment, the man stood still, almost contemplative. "When the time comes," he said, "you may find yourself on one side or the other of something very old breaking." Oswin raised a brow. "And which side are you on?" The man smiled faintly. "The one that survives." With that, he paid Oswin in gold this time, small Florentine coins, and vanished into the growing dark, leaving the smithy colder than it had been all week. Oswin watched the road long after the stranger had gone. Behind him, the forge crackled with fresh heat, waiting for the next job. But Oswin stood silent, thinking. Some armor was meant to protect, some to intimidate. But this was armor made for a secret war, and Oswin, the humble smith, had helped sharpen its edge. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.